You know what's funny about the really big moments in history? They rarely announce themselves with trumpets and fanfare. Most people were scrolling through their phones, grabbing coffee, or sitting in traffic when a courtroom in Washington just rewrote the boundaries of presidential power. No drama, no live coverage, just judges' legal briefs in a decision that could reshape how America does business with the world. And if you're wondering why you should care, let me put it simply. This affects your job, your investments, the price of everything you buy, and how much power one person can have over the entire economy. So let's break down exactly what happened, why it matters, and what comes next in plain English without the legal mumbo-jumbo. Here's the situation in one sentence. A federal court just told the President of the United States that he overstepped his authority when he slapped massive tariffs on our biggest trading partners. The Court of International Trade looked at how the administration used something called the International Emergency Economic Powers Act. Let's just call it IPA. And essentially said, hold on a second, that's not what this law was designed for. Think of it like this. Imagine your boss gives you a company credit card for emergencies, flat tire, unexpected client dinner, things like that. Then one day you use it to buy a new car because you decided the company fleet needs upgrading. Your boss is going to say, that's not what I gave you that card for. That's basically what the court did here. IEP has been around since 1977, almost 50 years. It's a law that gives the president special powers to act fast during genuine national emergencies. We're talking about freezing terrorist assets, sanctioning rogue nations, responding to immediate threats to national security. The key word, emergencies, and not whenever it seems convenient, not when you want to change trade policy. Emergency DASR. Throughout its history, IEPA has been used for targeted specific actions, freezing assets of terrorist organizations, imposing sanctions on North Korea or Iran, responding to cyber attacks, addressing specific immediate threats, but using it to impose sweeping tariffs on Canada, Mexico, and China, countries that together represent a massive chunk of all American trade. The court looked at that and said, this isn't an emergency. This is economic policy, and there's a difference. We're not talking about small symbolic gestures here. These were substantial tariffs that hit three of America's largest trading partners. Canada, our friendly neighbor to the north, who we trade billions with every single day. If Mexico connected to us through complex supply chains where parts cross the border multiple times before becoming finished products, China, love them or hate them, they're deeply embedded in how American businesses operate. These tariffs were part of what the administration called Liberation Day, a sweeping plan to bring manufacturing back to America by making imported goods more expensive. The problem, the court said, you can't remake the entire American economy by declaring an emergency and bypassing Congress. Here's what makes this ruling so important. It's not really about whether tariffs are good or bad policy. The judges didn't say, we think these tariffs are a terrible idea economically. That's not their job. Courts don't make policy decisions. They make legal decisions. What they said was, we don't see where Congress gave you permission to do something this massive. This is about the Constitution, about how power is supposed to work in America. Congress has the constitutional authority to regulate commerce with foreign nations. That's explicitly written in the Constitution. Now, Congress can delegate some of that authority to the president for specific situations. They can say, Armanura, President, in certain emergencies, you can act quickly without waiting for us to pass new legislation. But, and this is crucial, that delegation has to have limits. The court found that the way IPA was being used created what they called an unbounded delegation of power. In other words, it gave the president essentially unlimited authority to reshape trade policy however he wanted just by declaring an emergency. That violates a fundamental principle. Power in America is supposed to be divided, checked, and balanced. No single person should be able to restructure the entire economy without meaningful oversight. Let me paint you a picture of what this means for actual companies. Imagine you run a business that imports components from Mexico. 6 months ago, the government slapped a 25% tariff on everything you bring in. Suddenly, your costs skyrocket. You have three options. 1, pass the cost to customers who might stop buying. 2, absorb the cost yourself. killing your profit margins. 3, lay off workers or cancel investments to stay afloat. You choose option 3. You let people go. You cancel the factory expansion. You tighten your belt and survive. Then a court says, actually, those tariffs weren't legally valid in the first place. Now what? You might be entitled to refunds, potentially millions of dollars you paid in tariffs. That money could flow back into your business. You could rehire those workers. You could restart that expansion. But there's a catch. The ruling isn't final. Appeals are coming. Nothing is certain yet. So you're stuck in limbo. Do you plan for the tariffs staying? Do you plan for them going away? Do you restructure your entire supply chain or wait it out? That uncertainty, that's what businesses hate most. You can plan around bad news. You can adjust to higher costs. But when you don't know what the rules will be 6 months from now, that's when things get really hard. Here's where the story takes an important turn. The administration immediately appealed the ruling, and within hours, the Federal Circuit, the next level up in the court system, granted what's called an administrative stay. In plain English, the tariffs stay in place for now while the appeal proceeds. Think of it as hitting the pause button. The trade court said these tariffs are illegal. The appeals court said, hold on, don't change anything yet until we review this. So right now, today, the tariffs are still there. Companies are still paying them. Nothing has rolled back. But the legal foundation underneath those tariffs is shaky. Everyone knows this could go either way. And that uncertainty is creating ripples through every boardroom and trading floor in the country. The court used a legal principle that's becoming increasingly important, the major questions doctrine. Here's the idea in simple terms. If a decision has enormous economic and political consequences, Congress should be the one making it, not unelected officials in the executive branch. It's like the difference between your manager approving a $500 expense versus a $5 million investment. Some decisions are too big to be made without going through proper channels. The court said these tariffs have vast economic significance. They affect millions of jobs, billions in trade, the price of countless products, America's relationships with its closest allies. Decisions that big require explicit congressional authorization. You can't just find some vague language in a 50-year-old law and stretch it to cover something this massive. If you're an investor trying to value companies, this ruling just added a whole new variable to your calculations. Let's say you own stock in a company that's heavily exposed to international trade. Yesterday, you were modeling their future cash flows based on the tariffs staying in place. Today, you have to consider, what if the tariffs disappear? What if they're replaced with something else? What if Congress passes new legislation? What if this drags out for years? Every one of those scenarios produces different financial outcomes. And when you can't confidently predict which scenario will happen, you demand a higher return to compensate for that uncertainty. Higher required returns mean lower valuations. Lower valuations mean stock prices adjust downward. We've already seen some of this in market reactions. Not a crash, nothing dramatic, but shifts in certain sectors. Companies most directly affected by trade policy are seeing their stocks move as investors recalibrate their assumptions. And this will continue as the legal process unfolds. This isn't the first time courts have pushed back against expansive executive power. Back during the New Deal, the Supreme Court struck down key parts of FDR's economic recovery programs, saying Congress had delegated too much power to the president without sufficient limits. FDR was furious. His whole strategy was built on those delegated powers. When the court said no, it threw everything into chaos. Eventually, some programs got restructured with clearer congressional authorization. Others just ended. But an important principle emerged, even in an emergency, even when swift action is needed. There are limits to how much power can be concentrated in one branch of government. This case echoes that same principle. The court is saying, yes, the president has significant authority, but no, that authority isn't unlimited and the boundaries matter. Here's something people aren't talking about enough. This ruling affects America's negotiating power with other countries. If you're Canada or Mexico or China and you're negotiating trade deals with the United States, you just learned something important. American tariff threats might not be as solid as they seem. If foreign governments think tariffs might not survive legal challenge, does that weaken the U.S. position at the bargaining table? Maybe they decide to wait it out. Maybe they think, let's see what the courts do before we make concessions. That's a real consequence of this legal uncertainty. It's not just about what happens inside America. It affects how the whole world perceives American power and reliability. For decades, Congress has been happy to let presidents handle trade policy. The thinking was trade moves fast, the president can act quickly, Congress would just get bogged down in partisan fights and accomplish nothing. So Congress delegated authority and mostly stayed out of the way. But this court ruling is basically saying if you want the president to have this power, you need to say so explicitly. You can't just let vague old laws be stretched beyond recognition. That means Congress might actually have to legislate. They might have to debate, hold hearings, take votes, and explicitly authorize trade policy. Some people think that's great. Major decisions should go through that democratic process with all its public input and compromise. Others think it's a recipe for gridlock and dysfunction. Congress can't agree on anything these days. How are they going to pass comprehensive trade legislation? But that's the system we have. And this court ruling is saying, use the system. Don't try to shortcut it. Let's zoom out for a moment and talk about why this matters beyond just trade and tariffs. The Constitution divides power among three branches of government for a reason. The founders didn't trust any single person or group to have too much control. Over the past few decades, really accelerating since 9/11, there's been a gradual expansion of executive power during emergencies. Presidents of both parties have pushed the boundaries of what they can do without explicit congressional authorization. Sometimes that's necessary. Real emergencies require quick action, but there's a risk emergency becomes the new normal. Powers granted for exceptional circumstances become routine tools of governance. And when that happens, the balance of power shifts in ways our constitutional system wasn't designed for. This court ruling pushes back against that trend. It says, no, you can't use emergency powers as a general purpose policy tool. Emergencies have to be actual emergencies. Regardless of how you feel about these specific tariffs, having courts willing to enforce limits on executive power is healthy for the system. The million-dollar question, where does this go from here? C. The appeals process will continue. This will likely go to a higher court, possibly eventually to the Supreme Court if the issues are significant enough. In the meantime, confusion reigns. Some tariffs might stay in place during appeals. Others might be suspended. Companies will have to make decisions without knowing what the legal landscape will look like in 6 months or a year, as Congress might act. Thus, if lawmakers want these tariffs to be policy, they might need to pass legislation explicitly authorizing them. That would require the normal legislative process, debate, compromise, votes where the administration might pivot. They could rely on different legal authorities that weren't challenged in this ruling. They could try to craft emergency declarations that meet the court's standards. They could negotiate deals that don't rely on tariffs, multiple paths forward, multiple possible outcomes. And until we get clarity, everyone operates in uncertainty. Important to understand this ruling is narrower than some headlines suggest. The court did not strike down all presidential trade authority, touch tariffs imposed under other laws. Say the president can never act in emergencies, make a judgment about whether tariffs are good or bad policy. What they did say, that this specific laws, AIEA, doesn't authorize sweeping global tariffs, require clearer congressional authorization for actions. This massive apply limits to one particular use of executive power. Other tariff authorities remain untouched. The president still has significant power under different statutes. This isn't the end of executive trade policy. It's a boundary on how far one specific law can be stretched. If you're trying to figure out what this means for your portfolio, here's how to think about it in the short term. I have more uncertainty, more volatility, harder to predict how trade policy will evolve. Companies exposed to international trade face more risk, which means their valuations might need to adjust. Saw long terms, potentially more stability. A system where courts enforce meaningful limits, where power is checked and balanced, where no single actor can reshape everything unilaterally. That's a more predictable system over time. Uncertainty is uncomfortable now. But institutional strength, the commitment to boundaries, to process, to the rule of law, that's valuable for long-term investors. Warren Buffett has always said he invests in American businesses because America has strong institutions, courts that enforce limits, a government of laws, not just of powerful individuals. This ruling, even with all its short-term complications, reinforces that America's institutions still work, checks still function, power remains bounded by law. And that's worth something. Even if it's hard to quantify, here's the thing about boundaries. They're annoying when they get in your way, but they're essential for a functioning system. If you're the president trying to implement policy, court rulings like this are frustrating. They slow things down. They create complications. They force you to go through more processes and get more authorizations. But if you're a business trying to plan for the future, or an investor trying to build long-term wealth, or a citizen who wants to know the government can't just do whatever it wants, boundaries are good. They create predictability. They prevent sudden, massive changes that upended everything. They ensure that major decisions go through proper channels with proper debate. Yes, that makes government slower. Yes, that makes policy implementation messier. But it also makes the system more stable, more reliable, more trustworthy, and over the long run, that stability is the foundation everything else is built on. We live in an era of hot takes and breathless headlines. Every news story gets spun as either a complete disaster or a total triumph. Nuance gets lost. Context disappears. But the truth here is actually pretty straightforward. Once you cut through the noise, one, a court said the president used the law in a way it wasn't designed for. Two, the administration appealed and the tariff stayed in place during the appeal. Three, the final outcome will determine what authority exists for future trade policy. Four, in the meantime, businesses and investors operate with more uncertainty. Five, the system is working through a disagreement about power and limits, not a crisis, not a catastrophe, not the end of presidential authority or the collapse of trade policy. Just the government functioning the way it's supposed to, with different branches playing their roles, with disagreements being resolved through legal process rather than force or fiat. If you're still reading this far, you're probably wondering, okay, but what does this mean for me? Fair question. Here's what matters. Ferris, if you're a business owner or executive, legal uncertainty around trade policy is now higher. You need to model multiple scenarios. Don't assume current tariffs are permanent, but don't assume they're going away either. Plan for flexibility. Sarah, if you're an investor, companies with heavy international trade exposure face more risk. That risk needs to be priced in. But long term, a system with meaningful checks on executive power is actually more stable for investing. Fiasser, if you're an employee in manufacturing or trade-affected industries, your job security is tied to how this plays out. Tariff staying might protect some jobs. Tariffs going away might hurt others. The uncertainty itself is probably the hardest part of FAV. If you're a citizen who cares about how government works, this is a test of whether our constitutional system still functions, whether courts still enforce meaningful limits, whether power remains divided and checked. And so far, the system seems to be working. The appeals process could take months, possibly longer. Here's the likely path as next few months, the Federal Circuit reviews the case. Both sides submit detailed legal arguments. Oral arguments happen. Judges deliberate as possible outcomes. They affirm the trade court's decision. Tariffs would come down. They reverse it. Tariffs stay with stronger legal foundation. They send it back for more proceedings with different instructions. Or if it's a big enough deal, the Supreme Court might eventually take the case. That adds more months, possibly another year. In the meantime, the administrative stay keeps tariffs in place. Businesses operate under current rules while waiting for clarity. Bottom line, don't expect quick resolution. These things take time, and until we get a final answer. Everyone operates with incomplete information. Here's something that often gets overlooked in all the immediate political reaction. Strong institutions matter more than any single policy outcome. A country where courts can tell a president, no, that's a strong country. A system where power has real limits, that's a reliable system. A government where different branches cheat each other, that's a stable foundation for long-term prosperity. You can disagree about whether these specific tariffs are good or bad. You can have different views on trade policy. Reasonable people differ on those questions. But regardless of your policy preferences, you should want a system where authority has to be justified, not just asserted. Major decisions require proper authorization. Courts enforce meaningful boundaries. No single person can reshape the entire economy unilaterally. That's not about politics. What we're really talking about here isn't just tariffs or presidential authority. It's institutional health. And institutional health is the invisible foundation that supports everything else: a thriving economy, investor confidence, stable markets, and long-term prosperity. When a country's institutions are strong, when courts can push back against executive overreach, when laws are interpreted with care, and when power is meaningfully checked, businesses have a safer place to grow, investors have a more predictable environment to allocate capital, and citizens have more reason to trust that the rules apply to everyone, even those in power. If there's one lasting takeaway from this legal battle, it's this: think long term. The short term will always be messy. Tariffs may go up or down. Appeals will wind through the courts. Markets will swing as new information trickles out. Uncertainty will dominate headlines. But the bigger story isn't about a specific trade policy or a particular court case. It's about whether the United States remains a country governed by laws, not personalities. Whether the system still has the strength to say, this far, no further, even to the most powerful office in the land. And based on this ruling, the early evidence is encouraging. The court didn't make a flashy announcement or deliver a partisan punch. It simply did its job. It looked at the law, evaluated how it was being used, and said, this goes beyond what Congress allowed. And that's how the system is supposed to work. Quietly, deliberately, within the framework of the Constitution. The institutions are working, the checks and balances are functioning, the boundaries of power, while tested, are still holding. And while that might not generate viral headlines or electrify a news cycle, it is profoundly significant. Because at the end of the day, that quiet, deliberate enforcement of limits is what separates stable democracies from chaotic regimes. So, yes, the legal process is slow. The outcome is still uncertain. The short-term noise will continue. But the long-term signal is clear. The rule of law still matters. And in a world where too many systems are bending or breaking under pressure, the resilience of America's institutions is not just reassuring, it's a competitive advantage. And that is the real story, one worth more than most people realize.